Is there anything about the Christian worldview that you think is at least challenged by these scientific developments? Well, I think this is the most important example here, is probably evolution.
Darwinism proved to be an engine of atheism. If you're going to use evolution as an argument against God, first of all, you've got to know that evolution is true.
I mean, like, do you think that there is reason to doubt that I share a common ancestor with the chimpanzee?
Alex O'Connor presses John Lennox on if there is anything that challenges the Christian worldview. And he brings up evolution. And John Lennox's answer is absolutely brilliant. So let's get right into it, guys.
The revolution of biology with natural selection and Charles Darwin, even things like the revolutions in physics with quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Do you think that any of these pose any challenges to, say, the Christian worldview? Is there anything about the Christian worldview that you think is at least challenged by these scientific developments?
Well, we need to take them separately.
Sure.
And certainly, as one person has said, at least one, that Darwinism proved to be an engine of atheism.
Yes. Well, I think this is the most important example here, is probably evolution.
It is.
Yeah.
Quantum mechanics actually, to take your other example, for some people, opened up the possibility of freedom and all the business of giving, to put it this way, which I don't really like, space for God, so to speak.
Yeah.
And not confining the universe to be a deterministic entity. I think that it is a very interesting case in point that a lot of people jumped on the Darwinist bandwagon, and until relatively recently, it was often used as a reason to get rid of God in some way or other. My thinking of it is, well, it's quite complicated actually. First of all, the idea that there is a creator God is not going to be refuted by a biological theorem. I'm not even convinced they're in the same kind of category.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, evolution, whatever it does, and I'm saying that quite deliberately, whatever it does, is not an argument against the involvement of a creator. I spoke to one very leading, well-known biologist who is a strong believer in evolution and is a Christian. Wow. And I said to him, in the end, if I'm pushed to it, God can do it any way he liked.
I think what happened is that all the atheists were out there saying, you see, evolution proves there is no God. And because of that, all the creationists were like, oh my goodness, we need to debunk evolution right now. Not looking at evolution as a mechanism as God created the world. I'm not saying that we evolved from chimpanzees and it took us like a whole bunch of different species to get here. No, I don't think that's necessarily true. And people are saying the more we find out, we're realizing that we're nowhere as close to any other species. So I think obviously God created us there. But for people to be like automatically, there's no adaptation at all.
So that if it happens to be that way, that is not an argument against the existence of God, any more than the existence of an automatic self-winding watch, which uses random motions of your arm to wind itself up, is an argument against the existence of an intelligent watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
That calling in of randomness doesn't get rid of God at all. But of course, if you're going to use evolution as an argument against God, first of all, you've got to know that evolution is true and you've got to define what it does.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. And here you run into very many more difficulties now than you would have done 20 years ago.
Right.
And I just make 2 points, and they're quite important points. And that is, we need to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Richard Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say, I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard, that evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that.
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. Because evolution, again, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life
Yes.
to do
Wow.
anything. So it cannot be the explanation for life. Now, of course, people these days get round that by talking about chemical evolution and so on. That's nothing to do with mutation and natural selection, and we could go into that. But as a mathematician, it's the former interests me more. That is the origin of life itself, because it's almost equivalent, though not quite, to the origin of information. I see there a huge problem. But staying with, now, the second part of Dawkins' assertion, it explains all the development of life. Now, here's where I think one has to be nuanced and to be fair, because Darwin was brilliant. He observed things that people had not observed. He observed changes. For example, the famous study of the finch beaks in the Galapagos Islands. And I have a 1,000-page book at home, a famous book on that, and I've read most of it. And that was hailed as evidence, but of what? It certainly was evidence of cyclic change. What not so many people were aware of is that once the drought conditions disappeared, the proportion of long beaks to short beaks actually moved back to what it was before.
But yeah, to say that because you see that things evolved, therefore that means we know how the origin of life began is just ridiculous. It's crazy. Atheists still have to believe in one miracle, and that's the Big Bang. How in the world did this universe begin? How did it get started? Why not say a creator? In all of creation, there's some type of design and mechanism that is pushing it along in its DNA and its code. It's almost like it has a purpose, but people say it's a blind purpose. It's just like, why can't there be something pushing it forward? Why can't that be God? It's just mind-blowing to me.
Nevertheless, he could see that something was happening that filled niches and enabled existing creatures to adapt to new niches. Now, that seems to me to be uncontroversial because we can observe it. But when it goes beyond that to the creation, if I might use that word, of new life forms or all this kind of thing, I think that's a very different matter. Now, I'm very aware that I'm not a biologist. And secondly, I believe in Richard Feynman's wonderful dictum. He says the scientist outside his own field is as dumb as anybody else. And I've got to remember that. But I have tried to read my biology, especially in recent years. And I comfort myself that everybody from Darwin to Dawkins wrote for the intelligent public. They expect us to understand what they write.
Right.
And I have a huge difficulty with that kind of what we may call macroevolution. But much more interestingly is what has happened in the last few years with so-called systems biology, where the Darwinian mechanism, well, natural selection was his, mutation was later. But if we put both together and we have the neo-Darwinian hypothesis, that has been called into very deep question as being totally inadequate. Here in Oxford, Dennis Noble, one of the most fascinating characters, fellow of the Royal Society, and he's debated Richard on a number of occasions. And his argument is really in the end that natural selection, that neo-Darwinian thesis, doesn't need to be modified. It needs to be replaced because it's completely inadequate.
Wow.
Because now, and here I'm just saying what I read, the problem is, and it's a chicken the egg problem, that most simply perhaps can be realized. Here is DNA. You can't get DNA without a cell. You can't get a living cell without DNA. So how does that work? And what seems to me to be happening, and I've actually written quite a lot about this in a recent book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, that there appears to be a top-down causation, and it leads to a huge problem because it was enough level of complexity to discover that the DNA molecule was not simply complex, it was linguistically complex.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it gave us a 3.4 billion letter long word
Wow.
in a chemical alphabet. And all those letters had to be in the right order. That is a stupendous level of complexity, which is no.
I remember listening to Dr. James Tour talk about DNA and RNA, and then they also talked about junk DNA. They used to think that 98%, they would read about like 2% of the DNA and think that's the only thing that you needed to understand. And then they finally figured out that the much more complex DNA, which they used to call junk DNA, is now super, super important to understand how vastly different we are compared to any other type of species.
Chance of being generated by random processes. And Richard Dawkins agrees with that. He brings in something that natural selection actually has a different kind of operation, but we're not going to that at the moment. But the point is now, with the more recent discoveries of the nature of the living cell and all the chemical factories in it, there are levels upon levels of complexity beyond the genome. And that just beggars into unbelief, the possibility that any known mechanism can produce that without the input of intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm in your boat, but at an even sort of lower level below the deck, in that it's not just so much outside of my scientific expertise, biology, but I'm not even a scientist, and so I'm also aware of my limitations in being able to engage with this material. I do understand that on the popular level, I think like Stephen Meyer has been talking about this kind of thing quite publicly, and I understand that a lot of people are beginning to question at least Darwinian evolution. But to understand you correctly, would that entail doubting, for example, that, say, myself and a chimpanzee share a common ancestor? Because I understand that the mechanism of getting DNA off the ground and this kind of thing is this unimaginable mystery. But once we've sort of granted that, intelligently produced or not, does that suspicion go to that depth of evolution? I mean, like, do you think that there is reason to doubt that I share a common ancestor with a chimpanzee?
Well, it can do.
Uh-huh.
People are divided on that, and I understand the point very.
I'm really interested to see what he says, because Dr. James Tour he just says it's so different, the DNA now.
Well, from a mathematical point of view, if you take a set of things, you can often order them in a hierarchy. And that's clearly true in the animal kingdom. You can use various criteria for organizing them. But the whole question of common ancestry assumes that you've got a mechanism that drives the one to the other. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes use an argument that I think Darwin was aware of in some way. I have a vague memory that I got it from one of his letters. Mm-hmm. But it's something like this. You and I are biologists, and there's desperate need in the world for some kind of grain that resists, let's say, floods and so on and so forth. And we sit in the laboratory and we genetically engineer a new type of wheat that's very successful. 1,000 years hence, people are investigating the archaeology of this, and they're trying to determine what is related to what. Now, they know nothing about us or what we did. And their research, if it's done on the basis of a dominant naturalism, will completely miss the fact that there was an intelligent input at one point creating this new level.
And that'll be due to their methodological assumption.
Yes, that's right. And you can't blame them in a way if that's the way they're working.
Quite.
So it seems to me we've got to be extremely careful that the ability to organize things into various hierarchies is an indicator, certainly an argument for development without input of intelligence, but it's not conclusive. And it seems to me, in other words, my faith in God doesn't depend on whether there's a common ancestor or not. Certainly God could do it that way, but I'm not convinced that he has, because
people also say you have a creator that uses same mechanisms. That's why you could see similarities. But I don't know if that's a good one or not.
The analogy I gave you has got more to it than you may first realize, because it's saying that at a certain point there was an input from outside the system, an intelligent input from you and me as the scientists involved. Now, from the biblical point of view, and this has always interested me, the biblical description of creation is very minimal. It's 100 words, I think, Genesis 1 in Hebrew, something like that. But what is emphasized in that description has always fascinated me, because several times over you read, and God said. And God said. So these various stages, the days of Genesis, whatever you make of them, these stages are each introduced by God speaking. Now, again, the New Testament says very little about the how of creation, but it does say something. And it says something very profound to my mind, and that is, in the beginning was the Word. That is, the Word already was. And this is an existence statement, because it then goes on to say, through the Word, all things
were created.
Came to be, is actually what the Greek says.
Yes, okay.
It's fascinating. So the Word already was. The Word never came to be. The world came to be. You and I came to be. And then, of course, there comes the huge statement which shows John's fascination by existence. And the Word came to be human, or came to be flesh. God became human, which is a central Christian claim. But sticking at the creation level, my reaction to that is, this is a word-based creation. Now, do we see any evidence of that? I believe we do. First of all, in the fact that lots of things in our universe are mathematically describable. That is, we can use the language of mathematics to describe them. And that is so amazing that really clever people like Einstein saw that there was a problem. And you remember the famous thing he said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible.
Yes.
He could see that there was something absolutely amazing, that someone thinking here could come up with equations that described what's going on out there. So a word-based universe at that level. But then, much later than Einstein, we discovered that in biology, life is a word-based phenomenon as well.
Wow.
An information bearing macromolecule, DNA. So at the heart of the two sides, physics and biology, it's word-based. And that resonates very much with me. In the beginning was the Word.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. John Lennox did such an amazing breakdown. He's so brilliant. I'm praying that God continues to use him and that God will keep him healthy. John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life that was light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So guys, shout out to Alex O'Connor and John Lennox. In the description below, you will be able to watch the entire video if you want to do that. And also, guys, if you've never decided to follow Jesus, I encourage you to do that today. In the description below, you'll be able to click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. I really encourage you to do that, guys. It will be the best decision you could ever make. You guys were created to have a relationship with the Father, and through Jesus is how you can do that.